What happens when an 18-year-old with no legal training dares to take on the justice system? Alone? No lawyer, no resources, just the truth and the will to speak it. Most people thought Elijah Brooks was making a mistake, but what unfolded in that courtroom left even the judge speechless. This isn't just a story about a trial. It's a quiet confrontation with everything we assume about guilt, power, and who gets to be believed. Let's step inside the courtroom and see how one underestimated voice turned the system on its head. They didn't expect much from him. A wrinkled dress shirt, a second-hand briefcase, and a name no one had heard before. When Elijah Brooks stood up in that courtroom and told Judge Carter he'd be representing himself, the air changed, but not in his favor. There was a pause, followed by quiet chuckles from the prosecution bench. Judge Carter raised an eyebrow, lips tight, and asked Elijah if he even understood the charges. Grand theft auto and resisting arrest. Elijah nodded once, calm but not cocky. The judge sighed and leaned back like he'd seen this story before. Another young man, barely 18, trying to play hero before falling apart under pressure. To most people in that room, Elijah was already guilty. Not just of the crime, but of the audacity to speak without credentials, without a lawyer, without fear. The officers sat back with crossed arms. The court clerk barely looked up from her keyboard. But Elijah didn't flinch. He asked for the officer's incident report. He asked for access to the footage. He asked, quietly, for his chance to speak. For someone like Thomas McAllister, 72, a retired Marine who spent his youth watching men get silenced just for speaking out of turn, this moment didn't feel dramatic. It felt familiar. Thomas had once been denied the floor at a town meeting because he wasn't wearing a suit. He remembered the quiet sting of being overlooked. Watching Elijah now, he didn't see arrogance. He saw the courage of someone too used to being dismissed, finally refusing to sit down. And that's what made the silence in the room so loud. Not because a boy had chosen to represent himself, but because no one expected that boy to be ready. Elijah stood with his notes, his hands slightly trembling at his sides, and waited for the judge's approval. It came with a warning. "This court will not hold your hand," but Elijah only nodded. His voice was steady when he spoke. "That's all right, Your Honor. I'll walk." And with that, the case began. Not just against him, but against every assumption sitting in that courtroom. Elijah sat back down, opened a manila folder with creased edges, and gently smoothed out a printed photograph. It was the first piece of evidence, simple, quiet, and entirely underestimated. The courtroom settled into a strained quiet as Officer Daniels took the stand. He spoke with the confidence of someone used to being believed. He described the events of that night as if they were routine. A suspect spotted near a parked car, acting suspicious, then fleeing on foot. When asked how he could see inside the car, Officer Daniels pointed to a diagram and said he had a clear line of sight through the driver's side window. Elijah listened without interrupting, his eyes scanning the transcript from the initial report. When it was his turn, he approached slowly, holding a printed photo of the crime scene taken from the officer's angle. He asked Officer Daniels to identify the make and model of the car. The officer hesitated, then answered. Elijah nodded. Then, with the calm of someone who had walked this path in his mind 100 times, he asked, "Would you agree that the rear headrest on this model blocks most of the view from behind?" The officer paused. "Not entirely." Elijah showed him the photo. "And at 11:42 p.m., with no overhead lighting and tinted windows, you're saying you could see the suspect's hands on the wheel?" The officer shifted in his seat. "I saw movement." Elijah nodded again. "But not identity, not facial features, just movement." The prosecution objected. The judge allowed it. Elijah stepped back. He didn't argue. He let the contradiction settle. Thomas, sitting behind the gallery rail, leaned forward slightly. He remembered moments in his life when truth wasn't denied, but ignored. He'd once testified about a faulty radio during his service, but was dismissed for lack of technical expertise. Now, watching Elijah use calm logic instead of rage, Thomas felt some stir, a cautious kind of hope. Not for the system, but for the people brave enough to face it without armor. Elijah returned to his table, pulled out a second photograph, this one showing the car with its windows fully up and headlights off. "Let the jury decide," he said, "if anyone could see anything clearly through this." No theatrics, no anger. Just facts, delivered like quiet hammer strikes. Judge Carter looked at the photo for a long moment before nodding. The next witness was called, but something had already shifted. The officer's words no longer sat comfortably in the room. Elijah didn't celebrate. He only reached down, uncapped a pen, and circled a single sentence in the police report. A sentence no longer holding weight. The next witness took the stand, a woman in her 40s, dressed in a blazer too formal for the spring heat. Her name was Stephanie Cole, the registered owner of the vehicle. Her voice was careful, rehearsed, as she described discovering her car had been moved from where she last parked it. She said she never gave anyone permission to take it. Elijah waited. When it was his turn, he stood slowly, adjusting his tie with a deliberate calm. "Ma'am," he began, "did you notice any broken windows when you found your car?" She shook her head. "Any signs of forced entry?" "No." "Were your spare keys accounted for?" She hesitated. I hadn't checked." Elijah leaned in slightly. "So, to your knowledge, the car could have been accessed with a key?" She shifted in her seat. "I suppose that's possible." Elijah nodded once, then walked back to his table and picked up a small slip of paper. He looked toward the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Gregory Cole to the stand." A man in his 50s walked in from the back, dressed plainly, his expression tight. He was introduced as Stephanie's husband. Elijah wasted no time. "Mr. Cole, have you ever loaned your vehicle to a family member?" Gregory glanced at his wife, then looked away. "Yes. Did you loan this vehicle to your nephew, Alex Thompson, earlier that week?" Another pause. "Yes, I did." The room seemed to hold its breath. Elijah stepped back. "So, to be clear, the vehicle was not stolen. It was given by you to a member of your family?" Gregory nodded. "That's correct." A murmur moved through the courtroom like a wind through dry leaves. Elijah looked at the jury, then back at the judge. No further questions. In the gallery, Thomas let out a slow exhale. It reminded him of moments in combat when the threat didn't disappear with noise, but with realization. He'd seen men survive not by being louder, but by being smarter. Elijah wasn't winning with passion. He was undoing the narrative, thread by thread, until there was nothing left to cling to. Back at his table, Elijah sat down quietly. He didn't look at the jury, didn't try to gauge their reaction. He simply picked up the original charge sheet, crossed out the word theft, and underlined the word assumption. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't looking at him as a defendant. They were beginning to see him as the one asking the real questions. The screen lit up as the prosecution played the security footage, grainy, distant, with the familiar yellow timestamp flickering at the corner. A shadow moved across the lot. A figure approached the vehicle, opened the door, and got inside. Then, a moment later, the car pulled away. The room watched in silence. When the video ended, the prosecutor turned to the jury. "There you have it," he said, "caught on camera." Elijah waited until it was his turn. He walked to the screen, remote in hand, and rewound the footage. Then he paused it mid-motion. "Let's talk about what we're seeing," he said. "Or more importantly, what we're not." He pointed to the shadowy figure. "Can anyone here say with certainty that's me?" No one responded. No facial recognition, no distinct clothing, no timestamp showing who was behind the wheel before the car moved. He looked at the jury. "If someone wore my shoes, walked like me, would that be enough to lock them in a cell?" He turned back to the screen and zoomed in. The figure remained a blur. No clear face, no defining feature. The prosecution has called this video evidence. But evidence only matters if it proves something. This proves nothing more than a car was used by someone the camera couldn't identify. He walked over to the detective who had introduced the footage and began the cross-examination. "Detective Monroe, were there any fingerprints lifted from the vehicle?" The detective shook his head. The interior was wiped clean. Elijah raised an eyebrow. "So you have a video that doesn't show my face, and a car with no prints? Yet here I am." In the gallery, Thomas shifted in his seat, arms crossed. He'd seen entire careers derailed by blurry photos and confident voices. He once watched a fellow Marine lose rank over an accusation based on a mistaken ID. Truth, Thomas had learned, wasn't always loud or clear. But the consequences of ignoring that truth were. What Elijah was doing wasn't just defending himself. He was defending every man who had ever been misjudged by a camera, a system, or a story told too soon. Elijah ended his questioning not with a flourish, but with a pause. "If I had truly taken that car," he said, "don't you think someone somewhere would have seen something clearer than this?" He stepped away, letting the screen go dark behind him. For a long second, no one moved. Then Judge Carter leaned forward, chin resting on one hand, and said nothing. It was the kind of silence that comes not from doubt, but from reconsideration. Elijah returned to his seat and flipped the charge sheet over. He began to write something in the margin. No one could see it. But Thomas, watching from a few rows back, knew exactly what it was. A record. A trail. A quiet kind of truth, being built piece by piece. The door at the back of the courtroom opened, and a young man stepped in. He looked unsure of himself. Eyes down, sleeves wrinkled, walking like someone who hadn't expected to be called. His name was Alex Thompson. Elijah didn't introduce him with any dramatic build-up. He simply said, "This is the man who had the car before I did." The jury sat straighter. The prosecution objected, questioning relevance. Judge Carter overruled. Elijah began. "Alex, did your Uncle Gregory lend you his car last Thursday?" "Yes." "What did you do with it?" "I drove it to a friend's house. I parked it by the corner store overnight." "Did you lock it?" "I thought I did, but maybe not." "Did you see anyone take it?" "No. When I came back it was gone. I figured it had been towed." "Did you report it stolen?" "No, I didn't want to get in trouble with my uncle." Elijah nodded. "Did you know me before this trial?" "No." "Have we ever spoken?" "Never." Elijah looked toward the jury. No more questions. The room was still. Not quiet, still. There was a difference. Silence can come from routine. Stillness comes when something shifts. In the back row, Thomas rested his hand on the pew in front of him. This was the part he remembered most from his own battles. The moment when someone finally tells the truth, not because it saves them, but because it's the right thing to do. He thought about the young men he trained during his years in service. How rare it was to find one who could speak clearly, without fear, even when their voice shook. Alex stepped down and left the stand. He didn't look back. Elijah didn't watch him go. He just picked up the original police report again and quietly folded it in half. The charge of grand theft auto no longer stood on its own legs. The frame was cracked. The story was incomplete. And the boy they thought had no one just gained the most powerful witness of all. The truth. Judge Carter asked if the prosecution wished to recall any witnesses. They declined. Elijah sat still, breathing through his nose, his fingers gently tapping the edge of the table. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. But the quiet in his posture said enough. Another piece of the weight had been lifted. Another brick in the wall had come loose. They called it fleeing. He called it fear. When Elijah took the stand to explain why he ran from the scene, there was no dramatic tone, no attempt to stir sympathy, just a simple recounting of what he saw and felt. "I was walking past the store when someone grabbed my arm from behind," he said. "They didn't say who they were. They didn't show a badge. They just shouted for me to stop and started reaching for their waistband. Where I'm from, that doesn't feel like law enforcement. That feels like danger." The courtroom was quiet. No shifting in seats, no coughs, no tapping pens, just the slow dawning of understanding. Elijah turned to Judge Carter. "I wasn't running from a crime," he said. "I was running for my life." Then he looked at Officer Daniels, seated in uniform, his eyes narrowed. "You were in plain clothes. You didn't identify yourself. You ran up behind me. What would you have done if someone did that to your son in the middle of the night?" Thomas leaned forward, hands clasped. He remembered a night in '78, walking home in civilian clothes, when 2 local police officers threw him against a wall because he fit the description. No names, no explanations, just force. And when he filed a complaint, they told him he should have known better than to walk alone. Thomas never forgot that feeling. The way injustice doesn't need to shout to be felt. It just needs silence from the people who should have spoken. Elijah wasn't silent. He explained how his heart pounded, how he thought of his mother waiting at home, how he wasn't thinking about law books or rights, just staying alive. "I didn't know it was a police officer until I was already on the ground." He pointed to the bruises on his wrists, still faint but visible. "I didn't resist because I was guilty. I resisted because I was scared." There was no rebuttal. The prosecution didn't stand. Judge Carter didn't interrupt. For the first time since the trial began, the story shifted from what Elijah had done to what had been done to him. Back at his table, Elijah adjusted his chair slightly, exhaled through his nose, and looked ahead. He wasn't defending himself anymore. He was showing the room what it felt like to grow up having to. And for the first time, they were listening. The jury didn't need another witness. They needed a mirror. Elijah stood beside the projector screen, not to display more footage or diagrams, but to walk them through what the system had done, step by step, without raising his voice. "The arrest report says I was identified by sight," he began. "But we've seen that visibility was nearly impossible. The detective says the footage was enough to make an arrest. But we've all seen the footage. It shows nothing conclusive. And the car owner testified it was never stolen because her husband lent it out. So if none of those pieces fit, why am I here?" No one answered. Elijah didn't wait for one. "I'll tell you why. Because someone made a mistake, and instead of fixing it, the system decided it was easier to blame the person least likely to fight back." He turned slowly to face the prosecution. "And that's not an accident, that's a pattern." His voice didn't crack. It didn't rise. It simply landed. Each word like a tap on a locked door people were pretending not to hear. In the gallery, Thomas felt a quiet heat build behind his eyes. He'd spent years trying to explain to people that injustice didn't always come as fire and fury. Sometimes it came dressed in paperwork and procedure. Sometimes the system didn't need to be violent. It just needed to not care. What Elijah was saying wasn't just about one boy in one courtroom. It was about everyone who'd ever sat in that chair and watched their name get swallowed by assumptions. Elijah continued. "This case isn't just about whether I touched a car. It's about how fast we point fingers, how little we question what's written on a piece of paper, and how quickly we trust the louder side of the story. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for accountability." He walked back to his seat without looking at the jury, without pausing for effect. He knew this wasn't about performance. It was about clarity. The kind of clarity that didn't need to shout because the facts were finally speaking for themselves. The judge didn't say a word. Neither did the prosecutor. And in that silence, something became undeniable. The case wasn't about whether Elijah Brooks had fooled the system. It was about whether the system was ever prepared to admit it had been wrong. The jury deliberated for just under an hour. When they returned, the room held its breath. Not out of suspense, but because somewhere along the way, everyone had started to feel what was right, even if they weren't sure it would win. The foreman stood and read the verdict clearly. Not guilty on all charges. Elijah didn't react. He didn't slump in relief or raise his hands. He just closed his eyes for a moment and let the words settle where the accusations had once lived. The courtroom remained still. Then, slowly, murmurs of disbelief turned into nods of respect. Judge Carter tapped his gavel gently, more out of reflection than formality. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "what you've done here today is not common. You've exposed gaps in a process we too often assume is airtight. You stood alone when others might have broken. I suggest you consider a future in law." Elijah looked up, unsure whether the words were sincere or ceremonial. But the judge's face had changed. The skepticism from the first day had been replaced by something steadier. Maybe not admiration, but recognition. From the back, Thomas stood. Not to make a scene, just to acknowledge something that had been long overdue. For men like him, for kids like Elijah, for anyone who had ever walked into a room and been judged before speaking, this was a different kind of justice. Quiet, earned, and finally visible. Elijah packed his papers slowly. No rush, no fanfare. The manila folder that once held his defense now held something more. Proof that the truth doesn't need a title, just the chance to be heard. As he stepped out into the hallway, the late afternoon sun spilled across the floor. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. For the first time since the arrest, Elijah Brooks walked with nothing to prove. And yet, everything he did from this moment forward would be shaped by what he had just done. Not just surviving the system, but challenging it, reshaping it, and leaving it slightly less certain than it had been the day before. He didn't speak to the press. He didn't shake hands outside the courthouse. Elijah just walked down the steps, alone, with his folder pressed to his side. There were no headlines waiting for him, no celebration, no spotlight. But for people like Thomas, who stood just far enough back not to intrude, it was clear. Something had shifted. Later that week, in a small corner of his journal, Elijah wrote a single sentence. "They didn't believe me until I made them listen." That line stayed with him, not as bitterness, but as fuel. He began reading again. Not just case law, but civil rights briefs, wrongful conviction reports, books about public defense and ethics in prosecution. He reached out to a local legal aid office. He asked if he could observe, volunteer, learn. It wasn't a story of revenge. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about building something out of the space that injustice left behind. The kind of future where no 18-year-old would have to cross-examine a police officer just to stay out of jail. The kind of future where knowing your rights wasn't a luxury. It was the bare minimum. In his neighborhood, people started noticing. Not because Elijah talked much, but because when others were in trouble, they called him first. And he listened. Thomas watched from afar, sometimes crossing paths at the corner store. He never said much, just nodded. But there was pride in his eyes. The kind you carry not for what someone accomplished, but for the way they refused to disappear. What Elijah did in that courtroom won't make textbooks, it won't be studied in law schools or aired on cable, but it will be remembered by everyone who sat in that room and saw what happens when the system expects silence and gets truth instead. Elijah Brooks' journey was never just about proving his innocence. It was a quiet revolution against a system that too often fails to listen to those without power. His story reminds us that justice is not automatic. It must be claimed, piece by piece, with clarity, courage, and unshakable integrity. Elijah had no degree, no legal team, no influence. What he had was belief, in truth, in fairness, and in the right to be heard. That belief changed everything. This is not just a courtroom lesson. It's a life lesson for anyone who has ever been underestimated or dismissed. You don't need a title to speak the truth. You don't need permission to stand your ground. Sometimes, doing what's right means being the only one standing, even when no one believes in you. Especially then. Elijah showed that even the smallest voice, if grounded in truth, can challenge the loudest systems. And in doing so, he gave something back to all of us. A reminder that the fight for dignity isn't lost. Not yet. The truth doesn't have to shout. It only needs the courage to speak when it matters most. There are moments that stay with you, not because they were loud, but because they revealed something you always hoped was true. That integrity still matters. That standing up can still make a difference, even when the odds say otherwise. Elijah Brooks didn't just defend himself. He reminded all of us what justice is supposed to look like when stripped of titles, uniforms, and assumptions. And maybe that's the quiet victory we all needed to see. Type 1 if you've ever seen someone punished not for what they did, but for who they were. Type 2 if you still believe that truth, when spoken clearly and calmly, can change the room. If this story moved you, share it. And hit subscribe to keep these voices alive.